Welcome back to the Black Letter Podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Black Letter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Black Letter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Black Letter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to the Black Letter Podcast. With me today, back in our studio. Well, still sitting here in our studio for us, but for you guys, the next episode. This is the Black Letter Podcast. I have Tracey Pilone of Element 84, which is polonium on the periodic table, which has 84 employees, and polonium, the element, can be found inside of satellites, which is what Element 84 does. Satellites. I just helped them build their massive marketing pitch. Tracey, thanks for coming back. So the last show, I did say that Tracey was the CEO. She's actually the president and CFO of Element 84, so I'm making that brief correction, but she is the co-founder, along with her husband, of the company. Tracey, thanks for joining us again, or I guess staying here with me and not leaving. The end of last show, we talked a little bit about what you do, which is make big data from satellites understandable. You translate that for various organizations and manage the data and produce it. So where do you see Element 84 going? Not the periodic table Element 84, but the company Element 84. Where do you see you guys going in the next 5 years, 10 years? What's the trajectory?
I mean, I think there's I mentioned it at the end of the last one, but the application of the data, I think, is really very I think there's just the world is your oyster as far as taking that data and applying it to
So what could you do?
I mean, pick your thing. Wildfires. I mean, here in DC last week, we experienced wildfire smoke for the first time in my life. And those wildfire data monitoring you can do with all kinds of open data sets. And with climate change, there's going to be a lot more of that, which is good for business, not good for us as a world, but we can help with responses, making that more data driven. We've done some work there and want to keep doing more. Climate resiliency in general, I think, is something I'd really love to see us get into. To my pipe dream, if we ever get there, is to go back to a little bit of my construction roots in that there's a ton of resiliency work that needs to be done, and there's a lot of discussion about how to do that.
So explain resiliency work.
I was in Ocean City, New Jersey 2 weeks ago, and they've started seeing at high tide, their stormwater systems have started to flood.
Okay.
And they just raised a road a few inches. Those sorts of things, the bridge washes out. Are you putting the same bridge back? You should
infrastructure
not. You should put
changes.
A higher bridge back.
Yeah.
Or retaining walls or whatever, being really smart about having a sense of not only where we've been, but where we're going, to not put ourselves in repeated
So if we can predict the sea level is going to rise 3 feet in the next 50 years, we should be planning for that, not fixing it each time a storm comes through back to where we were.
Right.
So that's resiliency planning.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
So that looking at using existing historical satellite data and forward-looking data together, those data models, is that what you're talking about too?
Yep. And
help them predict what's needed?
Yes. And see what's happening in real time. I mean, you have to be cognizant of the time span and interpretation of the data is really, I think, a lot of the tricky part right now.
Okay.
Because if you go back, well, I mean, we don't have satellites that go back that far, but even, sometimes you should be looking at hundreds, tens, fives of years and trying to figure out what's going to happen coming forward is really difficult.
Right.
But figuring out how to design for the future is something I think as a group we need to do, and I would be really excited to see us do it.
Okay.
And help do it.
So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the business side of Element 84 and not so much the tech side. So you recently acquired another satellite data company and learned some things from that, had some experiences. What was kind of the key takeaway from that experience of acquiring another company? Because not many small companies acquire other companies. They usually get acquired, but you acquired another company of a like revenue size and brought it into your company.
Well, so the entirety of my business education was, I did get an MBA from Georgetown, but I graduated in 2020. So recent.
Yeah.
I took one class in mergers and acquisitions, so there was a lot of joking about that.
While you were doing the acquisition?
I took it 2 years beforehand. I was totally prepared. It's a totally different thing. I think from a business process side, one of the things that I appreciate now that I didn't then is there's just there's a lot of stuff. You can sprawl a lot. And I think trying to get your arms around that, I mean, I was on the acquirer side, so that's different. But having watched both sides of the transaction go down, like, it's just a boatload of work even to write down, here's like what we've got and what we do.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I think the biggest takeaway was it was like running two companies at the same time, and that was really hard.
You mean during the process? Is it still like that now?
No, it's getting, I mean, it takes a while,
It's a
right?
process.
To get through the process merges, for sure. And we're trying to be smart about picking the best of both.
Okay.
The company we acquired, Xavier, was in business for 20 years.
Okay.
Before, and we've been in business for 13, but there's a lot of experience there, and we don't want to just,
throw it away.
We're just going to do it this way. Yeah. So going through each of them and figuring out what, this is how we do staffing, or this is how we do resource management, this is how we do accounting, like figuring out what the best of both worlds is and trying to carry that forward.
But for the most part, what you acquired with this company was their engineers, their existing engineers and their contracts and they do satellite data as well?
Yeah, yes, their work historically has been closer to the decision makers, which is part of what was exciting.
Okay.
So that it's taking that data and making it closer to nonprofits and groups that are applying the data. And that's part of what we wanted to move into. So that's been really exciting to see too, is how the data gets applied and what people can do with it on a day-to-day basis, because it's a very different it's a different group of people you're selling to.
So if you could go back in time to just before you acquired this company, what would you do differently?
Last fall, sleep more.
Sleep more? Yeah, sleep more is probably good.
I think there's sleep more. I think being a little more realistic about how many random things were going to come up would probably be a good thing. I mean, we did the acquisition over the holidays, which was a little bit.
I think it's the unknown unknowns.
Yeah,
somebody famous once said you have the known knowns and the unknown unknowns.
There was a little bit of COVID in there. People have like their personal lives, and in the back of my head we knew it was holidays, whatever. But I think being a little more realistic about how hard that was going to be would have been better.
But at the end of the day, thus far you've turned the corner.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I think now it's just taking this list of it's working down the list and trying to figure out how to prioritize things. I think that is.
So what advice do you have for anything from your career path, construction, pregnancy, to satellite data, or starting the company, or running the company, or acquiring another company, any of it, or contracting with the federal government, contracting with the French government? What advice do you have for people out there that you think are kind of like, these are the things that, and I don't know if the MBA helped you massively, or if your advice is go back to school and get an MBA, or whatever it is. Do you have any thoughts for the listening audience?
Yes.
Words of wisdom. Good. She said yes with like a deep throaty, like, OMG, yes.
I think there's two things. One thing we've done that I think has served us well, and was not on purpose, but was we've built the business to be as flexible as possible. So our fixed costs have always stayed low, and we tend to only put in as much process as we absolutely have to keep going. Now, that's been a challenge post-acquisition, because we didn't onesie-twosie add people. We added a lot of things all at once. Right. So that's been a little bit tricky. But generally speaking, being able to stay flexible lets us meet customers where they are, because sometimes things come in the door and people say, can you do this? And we weren't thinking we'd ever do that.
Right.
But it sounded like a great idea, so we can respond. And keeping the projects stable in and of themselves, like keeping the projects organized, and then using resources that come out of those, like the profits that come out of the contract, to do stuff that will further the company longer term. So keeping that flexibility has been really important.
So flexibility
in the business structure.
And then you're also saying, so in the structure, and then you're also saying you're reinvesting earnings as opposed to pulling earnings out all the time. Your plan is to grow this.
Oh, yes. We've done that the whole time. We've been bootstrapped since the beginning. So we don't have any outside investors.
No debt, no outside investors.
No.
So that's first piece of advice. Anything else that you think you would share?
Flexibility
being number one.
I think being cognizant of your risk tolerance level and planning accordingly. So I am a risk averse person. Dan is much more risk tolerant than I am. The balance there has been good, I think, because it has kept us from going too far in either direction. But we've had backup plans upon backup plans. We have money in the bank. We've always saved that in the beginning. We used to keep 6 months' salary for everybody in the bank in case the customers went away.
Do you still do that?
No, we don't do that.
Okay.
Now what we do is we're diversified across contracts. And
I guess when it was the two of you, that was a little easier.
Yes. Yeah. for a while we kept doing that. So when we hired somebody, it was like, okay, I guess we just got to wait till the savings account floats back up.
Whoa.
But that was that's what let me sleep at night. And if you have in the back of your mind, if you're really, really worried about something, you can't look forward and do what's best for the business. So I think being honest with yourself about where your risks are and how you feel comfortable about them is really important, because there's a lot of things that people, I don't know, this is a silly example, but when we went into our office, we had to buy a bunch of furniture. Furniture's really expensive. The advice was to lease the furniture. And then you get to write off the interest and you don't pay for all the cap. But then I have a debt and we didn't want debt. So we just bought it. And at the time, the furniture dealer was like, what are you doing? And I was like, making it so I can sleep at night. But now I don't have to worry about paying that down. So it's a different mindset, but sort of respecting that in yourself, I think, is really important, because otherwise you're going to make yourself crazy.
Okay. So flexibility, understanding your own risk tolerance, and how to manage your own risk tolerance.
Yeah.
I guess, is that part of it? And do you have a third overarching point?
This is going to sound ridiculous, but people always quit on Fridays.
Okay.
They do.
Makes sense.
It's not a thing you think about. I have a whole thing about we don't do bad news at the end of the week, because I don't want to send people bad news and then they sit at the weekend and they feel miserable. Bad news always comes out early in the week.
Fair. Okay.
But the opposite of that happens to you as a leader, because people hit you with bad news at the end of the week frequently. That has been my experience. So I think the bigger takeaway is understand that you can control things coming out of you as much as possible to help manage your team, but you end up not being on the receiving end of the sad situation. You have to absorb the bad? Yes.
Is that the third point? You have to, as a leader, you have to absorb the bad
and try and buffer your team from it.
And buffer your team.
Yeah.
Okay, I love that.
Tough.
I mean, so if I were to summarize the three things that have made you successful, or do you have a fourth, or is those?
I think I'm good now.
The three? Okay, you think you're good?
Let's stick with three.
I think so. Flexible business structure.
Yep.
Understanding your own risk tolerance and how to manage that risk tolerance in a sensible way, which can mean a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing is people quit on Fridays. I think that's the easiest way to remember it.
Yep.
But the people quit on Fridays saying, I guess, is that you have to, as a leader, absorb bad news on a bad day to absorb bad news and buffer your team from it.
Yep.
So I like that, though. People quit on Fridays.
Yep.
And it's true. Because if you were quitting, wouldn't you quit on a Friday? I would, because that's, I'm going to go out and have a drink. I'm like, I just quit today. I told my boss, Tracey, to shove it, take her satellite data and send it to NASA. And I'm going to another company and going to look at the same data, but for somebody else. So, yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Tracey. I loved having you on the show.
Thanks.
I really appreciate the time. And please say hi to Dan.
I will.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And those few of you who are watching us on YouTube, thank you for watching us on YouTube and seeing our lovely faces. We'll see you next time on the Black Letter Podcast. Download us wherever you get your podcasts, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spotify, whatever you like. We'll see you next time on the Black Letter. That's all for today's episode of Black Letter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Black Letter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.